Okay, we're going to install Windows Server 2012 Standard Edition. It's going to be very similar to what we installed when we did the Server 2008. To start off with, I'm going to create a new virtual machine. And I'll go through this kind of quickly. You may or may not be able to keep up, but at least kind of take notes along the way. If you have your notes from 2008, just kind of copy them and just do a couple of tweaks along the way. I click next. I usually use custom just so I can see all the options, but I end up choosing defaults for, I think, almost all of them. Click next on here. Compatibility is basically saying what version am I saving this as. By the way, this is VMware Workstation 9. VMware Workstation 10 just came out last week, so we're going to figure out when or if we're going to upgrade this semester. Otherwise, we're over break. We'll have to check that out and do some testing. I'm really excited to try it out, though. I'm going to click next on there. I'll install the operating system later, because if you do the installer disk now, it does what's called an easy install. It kind of asks the questions up front, and then it tries to do it for you. That takes all the fun out of it. I want to do it. Why should I let the machine do my work for me? It makes it much more realistic. I click next, and it asks me for my guest operating system. The only purpose for this is to give you the defaults for the rest of the screens. You can choose anything on here, and it does not adversely affect your actual operating system. You get to go through and choose the type of adapters you want, the type of hard drives you want, the size of them, the amount of memory, the amount of CPUs. These are just going to give you recommendations based on Windows Server 2012. This is what we recommend. But you could choose anything and it'll still function properly. The virtual machine name. This is probably the most important screen on here. Not so much the name, but the location of it. It defaults to your C drive, and that won't work for the classroom because when you turn off your computer, it all goes away. I'm going to click Browse on here, and you want to put it to your portable drive. I want to go to my D drive. And now it's also important to organize your files and your virtual machines appropriately so you can find them and keep them organized. You could take all your virtual machines and dump them into one folder, and you would have 5 or 6 of them all in the same folder, and they will function. It's going to look like a mess. It's going to be very difficult to manage and maintain them, but it will function. The computer will be able to take care of it. It's just difficult for us to figure it out. So the best way is to keep each server in its own folder. I have a special folder for all of my virtual machines, and then I break it apart by class. So this is a Server1 class. And I'm making a Server 2012 server. If I have other ones, I'll make sure I have a unique name to it. I'm just going to call it Windows Server 2012. So I'm going to make a new folder. Windows Server 2012. And then I click OK. And now this is the time to double check, because sometimes when you make new folders, you might not actually point to it. You may have created it but not actually selected it, or it's still called new folder or whatever, and then making sure that this is the virtual machine name that you want to be using. So go ahead and click next. These are all defaults, again, based on Windows Server 2012 in the virtual environment. It defaults to 1 processor, which is fine. We're using quad-core machines with hyper-threading, so it looks like we have 8. So you could choose up to 8 processors if you wanted. We'll just keep it as 1. It also defaults to 2 gigs of RAM. That is the minimum is a gig, but 2 gigs is a pretty good number. We have 16 gig to work with. This machine only has 12, so the maximum's a little bit different. But you could upgrade it to 4 gigs if you wanted. 2 seems to work just fine, though, the recommendation.
Isn't 512 again?
It isn't. Not for 2012. 2012? Let me just double check real quick. Oh, absolutely, you are correct. The minimum for here is 512.
So almost like 8 runs better on the machine than 7 then.
I wouldn't recommend putting 512, because when Microsoft says minimum, that means barely scratching to run. Like, don't bother opening Notepad. So, I mean, 2 gigs is what they recommend. We have plenty of memory. We'll use 2 gigs. If you have limited resources, I would still only go down to 1 gig. and see how that goes. Try it at 512 and see if it functions. I think you have a lot of disk thrashing and stuff though.
You can go back into that tool though and just
At any time later on, you can go under VM settings and you can change the memory. Kind of interestingly enough, if you increase the memory, you can actually do it while it's running. You can't decrease the RAM on a system while it's running. I don't usually recommend that. I recommend shutting it down, change the memory that you're going to put on a machine, and then boot it back up again. But you can, and we've done it in class just for fun, you know, take a Windows 7 machine and while it's running, bump up the memory from 2 to 4 gigs. Pretty cool. But that's always changeable. So you can come here, change it to 2 gigs, go home, change it to a gig, go back and forth. Just try to remember to do it before you start the machine is the best way to do it. Okay, we'll keep the default there for next. Network address translation, this is what we used last time for Windows Server 2008. We'll use this again. It's just kind of like your home network. You end up having a private network on your computer. It still can get to the school's network, but it keeps your server, your environment separate from everybody else's. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. You get network access and you get your own private network. These don't matter. These are your I/O controllers. They recommend LSI, Logic, SAS. I'm not sure what other options there would be. And you do want to create a new virtual disk. More advanced virtual days. We won't get into this in this class at all, but you can use an existing virtual disk. So if you create a virtual disk for another machine, you could actually be pointing to it. Or what's even more interesting is you can use a physical disk. So you can actually point to a real live hard drive or a, but then it's the whole drive. It's not just a file. So if you're pointing to your hard drive, it's going to wipe out your hard drive. And it's going to format it to what it's going to be doing. So be very, very careful of that. It says for advanced users, it's not that scary, but, don't just choose it. Oh yeah, let me try it on my portable hard drive. It's going to get reformatted the entire drive. It does perform significantly faster, though, than using a virtual drive. But we don't want to do that. It recommends SCSI over IDE. This is the default. And it recommends 60 gigs for your server 2012. It doesn't take up nearly that space. It expands it as it needs it, so it doesn't really matter what you put on there because it's only going to make it as large as it needs to be. The name of the file for your virtual machine, and then click Finish. So far this is the exact same process as you did for 2008. The only difference is you just put it in a different folder and you called it something different. We still now need to insert the DVD into the drive to boot to that CD, and we do that by clicking on CD DVD. And we click on the ISO image file to use. And we click on there, we click on Browse. And now you have to find where you kept those files that I gave you at the beginning of the semester. And I put them under Windows, Server Admin. These are my Server Admin files that I gave to you. We're installing 2012, and so that's where I need to select that. I click Open. Once you're all set, kind of double check, everything looks fine. I have my CD in there, and I can power on the machine. I'm going to use Control-Alt-Enter to make this full screen. I just like the environment a little bit better. It's a little bit different splash screen. Now it's the Windows Server 2012. This is going to look very, very similar. It's the same initial screen. I click Next, and just the simple install. Nice, simple, big install button. Instead of having all the selections that we had for Server 2008, though, we only have 4 here. And really you have, again, the two categories. You have standard and data center, and then each of those branch off to two more options, which is your GUI or your core install. We will be doing the core next, but we're going to be starting with the GUI. It's going to be a little bit easier to work with and get into. So we're going to do a GUI installation. The installations are identical. It's your environment after you restart the server that's different. Either you have a command prompt or a GUI environment. And when you click next, thoroughly read the license agreement. It is different than 2008, so you want to make sure you do that. I did that last night, so I'm going to click accept. And then I'm going to choose the custom install Windows only, and it's advanced. Well, that's my only option. I'm not sure why it's advanced. That's like the most basic thing you can do is install a server from scratch. I have nothing on my machine. I want to install an operating system. That's an advanced function somehow. I'm not sure how. I only have one drive here. Many servers will have multiple drives, and that will get confusing, so you really have to be able to know which physical drive you're going to be putting this on. We only have one, so that's easy. And now it goes through the same process of copying Windows files, getting the files ready, installing the configuration, updating, and then finishing, and then it ends up rebooting. It does everything on its own. The next thing that you end up seeing, more or less, is the logon screen, I believe. I don't know if there's another screen that pops up before then. But anyways, this is a good time to take a break since it does take a while to expand these files. When we come back, we'll finish this up. Doesn't take very long, just a few minutes. Eventually the next screen that comes up is your settings for your password. We're going to use the same password that we used before, the one that got confused in the lab sheet, so I'm not sure how I'm going to type on the new lab sheet, but it's capital P A $$W0RD. They tend to use that a lot with their with Windows. I can't type and talk. Your Windows passwords and things. So capital P A lowercase a $$W0RD. And then you get into this screen. Control-Alt-Delete to sign in. This is a virtual environment, though. We can send the Control-Delete two ways. One is by going up here and clicking the little button that says send a Control-Delete to the virtual machine. So I can do that. If you like staying on the keyboard, though, then you can do Control-Alt-Insert. I tend to go back and forth. I thought I had a tendency, but I do go back and forth. If my hand's on the keyboard, I use the keyboard shortcut. If I'm already scrolling around, I'll end up using my mouse, so it doesn't matter. Either way. It automatically launches Server Manager, just like Server 2008 did. But after that, things look considerably different. Server Manager in 2012 will have these big buttons as far as these are the steps that you kind of need to complete, whereas in Server 2008, it just gave you a screen to start filling some things in, like change the computer name, change the IP address, and those kinds of things. We're not going to work with a whole lot in here right now. Just showing that it is here. I'm going to scroll around here. I'm going to close this Server Manager. If you notice down the bottom, you do not have a start button, but you do have a couple quick start items on here. The three that they give you automatically, the first one is Server Manager, the thing that you just closed. You use it a lot, so it's going to be there. The second thing is a PowerShell window. When you're, this is PowerShell. It's going to look like Command Prompt. The difference is it's going to have a blue screen, and also it's going to have a PS in front of it. So if you're ever in Command Prompt, it's going to have a black background with just a C:\\. PowerShell is going to be blue with a PS in front of it. So just be cognizant of where you are. The third item that they give in the bottom is just the File Manager, Windows Explorer. Everything like that is pretty much the same. I have my drives, directories, and so forth. Oh, missed my X. You do have the tiles though. If you kind of hover, if you kind of click in the lower left, I should say, or hover way down, it does say start, and you come up to the tiles. Later on, as we add more services to the server, like Active Directory, you're going to have a whole another set of tiles over here dealing with administration, like DNS, DHCP, users and computers, all the Active Directory tiles on there. To switch back is the desktop. The other option of switching back and forth is just tapping the Windows key on your keyboard. And if you're not familiar with this environment at all, the most difficult thing to do is how do you turn this thing off? We're used to going to start and there is no power button. So what do I do? Well, either on the tile screen or they call it the Windows 8 screen, or on the desktop, if you hover over, I usually the lower right hand corner. If you come down to the lower right hand corner, you get this Charms bar. It's called Charms bar. Not sure why it's called Charms, but that's what it's called. And the three main things that you get are search, start, and settings. Search lets you search for anything, documents, applications, whatever. Let me escape out of that. Oh, I went too far. Start just takes you back to the main start screen. And then you have the settings button. Settings is where you power this off. So I've hit the settings button. Now I have my network settings, I have my sound settings, I have my display settings like brightness of the screen, I have my keyboard settings, and you have our power settings. But not just power settings, these are your power, to shut off, shut down, and restart. Before I do that though, I do want to install VMware tools on the server. That way I can, take benefit of, the virtual environment. Right now you can see it doesn't quite fit on my screen. I have to scroll a little bit. And there's other features and functions that's going to do as well. To install VMware tools, go up to the menu up on top and go to VM and install VMware tools. And click install. And this is where it sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. What you're doing, what VMware Tools does when you go to install it, it takes that D drive that you use for your Windows installation and it mounts another virtual disk with the VMware Tools. Now it should auto launch and restart. Sometimes it doesn't. If it doesn't start in a couple seconds, just go down to your file manager and you can go down to your D drive. So right here's your D drive and you have your setup. This is 64-bit, so you can just double click on the setup 64-bit and you can run it that way. Like I said, it should have popped up automatically because you do have an auto run, but for some reason on the Server 2012 it doesn't always work. Sometimes, but not always.
Did you put auto run?
No, I clicked setup 64. And so you can see it looks like something in your D drive. So it took off your Windows CD and put this in its place. And it takes a bit there, and finally it's up. So Windows is going to install VMware Tools. Click Next. And typical is perfectly fine. We don't do anything special on here at all. And click Install. It does CPU performance enhancements, it does video enhancements, and it does networking enhancements. So it's definitely something valuable. The biggest thing you're obviously going to see is the video. It's going to fit better on the screen and give a little bit better environment. It says you must restart your system when you're done to take effect. Go ahead and do that.
Is 12 the only one that you have to do the tools with?
We did it with 8.
We did it with 8. I do it with anything, whether it's Linux, desktop Windows, server Windows. You should install tools on anything. In fact, we're going to do it with the core later on, but we're going to have to do it through the command prompt. It's a pretty quick server in regards to being able to shut down and restart and bring it back up. And it's already restarted. Control-Alt-Insert to log back in. $$W0RD. And I have my server. It's going to launch the server manager every time until you tell it not to. So I'm going to let it finish that up. And then when it does come up, I'm just going to close it. This is a perfect time to take a snapshot. It's up, it's running, you haven't done anything to it yet, and you haven't messed it up. So you're good to start with something basic at this point. So how I do this is I shut this down. I go to Settings, Power, Shutdown. You don't have to type anything in. In 2008, you actually had to type something on the keyboard. Here you can just say it was unplanned and hit continue. Again, for policies and procedures, they might want to have you do this, and they might be very, very adamant about this, saying that you have to choose a reason for this. It's going to end up in the log, so you can see why this go down or whatever, and you can sort of track of why my server's going down, why it's being taken down. Again, it shuts down very, very fast. At this point, this is time to take a snapshot. Don't get confused on snapshots again. It's not a screenshot. It's not a screen capture. It's taking a snapshot. It's basically making an image of my entire machine at this point and sort of marking it in time and space. VM, snapshot, take a snapshot. You can call it anything you want. Initial install, base image, and make a description of it. Snapshot immediately after install and installation of VMware tools. Now, as we do different things to the server and we decide, you know what, I don't want to do this, I want to branch off, I want to do it again, I can just say I want to go from here and then start over again, but I can keep these things. We talked about snapshots before, right? Okay, so you're kind of, remember that? Just playing around with this a little bit. Let's go ahead and power on the machine. We'll change the computer name and we will change its IP address. So the basic things that you want to do with every server is give it a static address and give it a meaningful name. Otherwise it just gives a random Windows name, which isn't very meaningful. I believe we did the server name at least on server 2008. I don't think we had to change the IP address. After Server Manager loads, it says the very first thing you should do is configure the local server. And once the screen comes up, it's going to look very similar to the screen that comes up by default in Windows Server 2008. You kind of just have to go down the list and sort of take care of these things, like the computer name, adding it to a domain, what is this IP address is going to be, what time zone are you part of, and you sort of just kind of just fill in this stuff. So it's not a whole lot different. Let's change the very first thing from the computer name. So if you click on computer name, And by the way, let me just back up a little bit. All these things can be done, and in fact are done through other control panel and other system settings throughout Windows. You don't have to be in Server Manager to change the computer name. In fact, you'd go to like Computer, right-click, Properties, Change Name. This is the same. This is the same screen. It's just a kind of bringing everything together window. This window sort of is bringing everything together, and then as you click on it, it'll launch the other, I guess, applets that manage that area. So it gets really confusing. A lot of people type in the name here. That's just the description. That doesn't do anything. To rename the computer, you have to click change. By the way, has anybody ever done that? They changed the computer name here? I have done it. It's just like, why did it change? Because that's not the computer name. This is the computer name right here. Go ahead and change it to Server1. You can also join a domain if we have one. We don't have one yet. We're going to keep this standalone. We're just going to call it, just keep it part of work group. Click OK. It is going to make you restart. Every time you change a computer name, that's one of the core parts of identifying who you are. And so it does want to restart. But we're going to restart later. There's a couple of things we can do without having that effect. So the computer name doesn't change. So the computer name doesn't change until you restart, but that's okay. Kind of going down the list here, we have the Ethernet address. IP version 4 address is assigned by DHCP. It's assigned automatically. We want it to be a static address. We want to control it. Servers usually have a static address. By clicking on it, you actually come to the network connections window, which you can get through the control panel, which you can get through from the little icon in the system tray down here. There's all kinds of different ways. There's, again, nothing special about that link. Now, for some people, it just kind of gets dumped here. It's just like, well, what do I do this now? How do I change their IP address? You have to right-click on the adapter. This is the adapter itself. And then you go to Properties for that adapter. And even from here, it gets a little confused. Like, what do I do with this? Well, these are IP version 4 settings. So I'm going to click on IP version 4. And then click on Properties again. Now you have the screen to work with that you need to fill in all your stuff. Make a note of this somewhere. Put it in your notes. Put it in a piece of paper somewhere. You will need to type this in. The IP address is going to be a static address. We're going to be using 192. Oh, I forgot to put numlock on. 192.168.118.60. Again, that's 192.168.118.60. It defaults the subnet mask to 255.255.255.0. It's a Class C address. That's perfectly fine. That is exactly what we're using. The default gateway is a little unique. Most default gateways are either a .1 or a .255 or 254. This is actually a .2, so it's going to be 192.168.118.2. This is your default gateway. This is what's going to get you off your network. That's a VM thing. That is the default gateway for that private network that you've created, and so that will get you off of the network and onto the school's network. The DNS. If you have a DNS server, we can do that. You can actually point it right back to your default gateway, and then VM will take care of that and dump it out to the DNS that it needs to. At least that's the way it's supposed to work. And we can try that next. And you can click close when you're done with all that. And you can close the networking connections windows. I'm going to click on the, right now it still says it's a refresh button assigned by DHCP. There's a refresh button up on top. The little arrows are circular. And now it tells me new information. So my Ethernet address is now 192.168.118.60. If I want a PowerShell, I can go to PowerShell. PowerShell ipconfig is one of those that works in PowerShell and in command line. So I can get my IP address, and you can see that it is, it is correct. The default gateway is on there as well. It doesn't show my DNS on there, so I'd have to do an ipconfig/all to get my DNS server there as well. To test it to see if it works, let me try pinging something. I know Google responds to pings. Not everything responds to pings. And hopefully it can resolve the name. And it does. So it resolves it, and I can ping it. So now you kind of know that you have your networking settings proper. By the way, if you're using Fusion, you might have an issue with this, because on VMware Workstation, we're able to tell it that we're in the 192.168.118 network, and we haven't been able to find a way to do that in Fusion yet. So you might be in a different private network. So that might be a little issue. The only time you'll run into that problem, though, is if you're trying to get off that network, like to another server or to the internet or something like that. Other than that, everything else will be the same. So you just might not be able to get to the internet. To get out of PowerShell, you can just type exit. So I've changed that. Kind of going down here. Windows updates not configured. Normally you'd configure this to how you want this to be done. Manually, never updated, whatever you want to do. Kind of scary having servers being updated automatically whenever, because you don't know if it's going to conflict with something. So you really, really want to control that. You want to roll out the patches when you know it's going to work with your systems. So we're not going to do that right now. One thing we will change, though, is the time zone. The time zone is set to Pacific time, because the world revolves around Redmond, Washington, and Microsoft, I guess. You click on the change the time zone link. That brings up to the date and time window, and then you can change the time zone here. It defaults to -8. We're at -6. US and Canada Central Time. Automatically adjust time for daylight saving time. Absolutely. And then we click OK. And so that should take care of the server time. It does look as pretty accurate. Those are the things we want to change. Now we need to reboot, though, in order to get our server name changed. So let's go ahead and reboot. I'll close the server manager. Settings, power, restart. Controlled insert, enter my password. Brings back to Server Manager. If I click back on configure this local server again, which is kind of the main screen I start with, my server name got changed to Server1. Any questions on this so far?
The DNS was the same as your gateway?
It was. Yeah. Not typical in a network environment. You'd actually point it to your DNS. We don't know what it's going to be depending on whether you're at home or here or whatever. So if you point it to your gateway, it will then forward to the DNS that it knows about. Run. So always make sure you take snapshots to represent your current state, so you can always come back to it.